Good evening, blog viewers. Today I want to talk about one of the essays, again, in Carl Jung's work that we've been looking at. Jung has been very helpful in sort of understanding different dimensions of human personality. And today I want to launch right into it and talk about a very important essay of Jung's called the general description of the types. And in that essay, he, in a span of about 100 pages, he discusses the sort of 8 common personality types, of human personality types. And they're broken down by either extrovert or introvert, terms that I think are quite familiar to, just checking that, quite familiar to everybody. Beyond that, he describes, or he breaks down the types into either a thinking type, a feeling type, a sensation type, or an intuitive type. So there are 8 types in total. There would be the extroverted thinking, extroverted feeling, extroverted sensation, extroverted intuitive, and then introverted thinking, introverted feeling, introverted sensation, and introverted intuitive type. Now, as I was reading this, I was immediately sort of a little bit skeptical. You know, how can any one person fulfill any of these sort of stock types? It seems like, you know, the human being is so complex. We all have so many dimensions of our personality that it's kind of silly to say one person can really fit into this little type. And Jung is actually pretty aware of that criticism, and he says, you know, these types should not be viewed as sort of types that one would find in the world. We can't find anyone that exactly fits this type. Everyone's going to sort of fall short of the type to some extent. So the type is sort of an ideal account. But while it's an ideal account, it can still explain sort of the general dominant tendencies of certain people we find in the world and ourselves. So it's useful to understand human personality through types, even if there's no particular person completely fits 100% into any type. And I think these are comments, this was a point that I think was well brought out by Zizek in one of his lectures when he was talking about no particular CEO, he said, in the world ever fits the role of a CEO completely, and no particular president ever sort of fits our mental conception of a president. There's always some gap between whatever we imagine the person to be in a certain role and the actual reality of that person. There's always a gap. In some people it's a big gap, in others it's a small gap. So we should understand, I think, Jung's ideas about general personality types is giving us sort of a good head start on understanding people and understanding different personality traits, but not at all being sort of a complete solution or a complete answer to every dimension of our personality or anyone else. It's sort of the beginning and not the end. As we kind of go through this, we'll see that when Jung describes the types, he focuses on some of the advantages of the types, sort of what they gain from that certain personality type. But he also very quickly goes into some of the limitations of the type and sort of the drawbacks of that personality type. And it's important to, I think, gain a sense of that. I think as we are focusing on what is good for the human being and attaining human good, fundamentally, I think, as we've seen, attaining human good means a life committed to perfection, committed to ever greater perfection. It's a striving process. Continually, we work on it. It's an ascent to ever greater perfection. It's an ideal life that we're describing as to human good. It may not be the life that most people live in the world, but that doesn't mean it's not the life we should strive to live. It's sort of a critical point for me, that the point that there is, and I think Ian Shapiro brought this out well in one of his essays, that the fact that there's a gap between the ideal and the practice in everyday life means we should do all we can to bridge the gap. It doesn't mean that we should totally give up on the project of improving ourselves and perfecting ourselves in various ways. So we are trying to live as best as we can, not necessarily as everyone else in the world does, and that's a very important point, which I think will also be brought out in today's discussion. Now, in general, Jung sort of divides the personality types first amongst, as we said, introverted and extroverted, and then he breaks them down even further after that. Now, with regard to both of these types, he says, the introvert and the extrovert, these are types that transcend different classes of people, different races, different occupations, different socioeconomic groups. These are types that we would find at random throughout the population. Even amongst all of these different classes, races, and occupations, you can have an introverted lawyer, you can have an extroverted lawyer, you can have a introverted teenager, you can have an extroverted teenager. So it's sort of basically found, all of these types are found randomly throughout the population. He says, Jung says, in one family you can find a child that's an introvert, but then the sibling is an extrovert. But because of that, and because that the types are found randomly, Jung stresses that that these types are really not the result of conscious choice. These types are sort of personality types we assume sort of unconsciously as a result of our unconscious, instinctive personalities, and that's an important point to not lose sight of, at least for Jung. That people sort of instinctually gravitate toward one or the other type. If they are sort of forced, Jung says, into one of the other types, for example, in the way they're raised as a child is encouraged to be an extrovert when he's in fact an introvert, then that individual will have problems, Jung thinks, so later on, because he's being forced into a type that he's not, and he can only be cured, Jung thinks, by basically going back to the type that he was originally, that he was intended to be, the personality type that was sort of that he was pushed aside intentionally by parents or whoever else. So, so that's a really important point that we'll come back to at the end, a critical point in regard to these types. Now, the extrovert, he defines or discusses sort of, I wouldn't say he defines these types, but he sort of gives general ideas about what the different types are like. And the extrovert, Jung says, basically he expands and sort of creates himself to fit his environment. He's not someone that really focuses on the inner life or the life of the mind or his own conceptions of, or his own subjective perceptions of the world. But all of that stuff is sort of kept in abeyance, or inner subjective thoughts are sort of buttoned up so that the individual can sort of fit well within a society or group. This person continually sort of tries to match up or tries to meet the demands of other people in his life. The social group he's involved in, the job he's involved in, the family, all of those things. This person tends to, Jung thinks, imitate others. He has sort of a general niceness to him and a rapport because, again, he's looking very much to fit in. In terms of his moral views, Jung says an extrovert is likely to have many of the similar views with the general society, again, because he's not looking to rock the boat, he's looking to fit in, he's looking to sort of perfectly adjust to the general environment that he finds himself within. He's not an innovator, the extrovert. If there were sort of changes in how the society was sort of valuing things, either morally or in other ways, the person would quickly adapt accordingly. He would change himself, the extrovert would, to match his environment, to match the values of the environment he was in, the job, again, the family, the nation, whatever it is. But the person is fundamentally driven by the external environment he finds himself within and matching that environment as best as he can. That is a description of the extrovert. Now, very quickly, Jung focuses on the downside of extroversion, and he says that the issue here is that if the extrovert is constantly imitating, constantly mimicking, constantly adapting the values and the practices of everyone around him, well, he's going to share, or she's going to share in the general collapse of that environment. There's been no sort of inner life developed. There's been no independent values cultivated. So basically, that person will do just as well as everyone else is doing. If the environment that he's imitating or being an extrovert in, if that environment is not, in Jung's phrase, if the values of that environment conflict with sort of the universal demands of life, I think as Jung puts it, the person will suffer for that, because the values are conflicting either with reason or with or human good, or what's good for the person. But the person just doesn't really recognize that and is sort of imitating and adopting those values. So the person will share in any sort of general decline of the milieu he's in. He's getting sucked into the objects outside of himself. He's losing himself in these things. Sort of the inner life, the unconscious, the personality traits that we've talked about in prior posts, the important sort of naturalness of life that sort of exists in the unconscious. All of those things are being starved. They're not necessarily being cultivated at all. And so those things are sort of given short shrift again, because the person is adapting to the environment. I want to read this passage from Jung. He says, as may be gathered from what was said in the previous section, a purely objective orientation does violence to a multitude of subjective impulses, intentions, needs, and desires, and deprives them of the libido that is in their natural right. Man is not a machine that can be remolded for quite other purposes as occasion demands, in the hope that it will go on functioning as regularly as before, but in a quite different way. He carries his whole history with him. In his very structure is written the history of mankind. What a beautiful sentence there. Man is not a machine that can be remodeled for quite other purposes as occasion demands, in the hope that it will go on functioning as regularly as before, but in a quite different way. So the extrovert, as we've talked about in some of the other posts, suffers from sort of the starvation of the unconscious, starvation of these subjective impulses, these intentions, these subjective desires, these things that are not sort of on the surface but are still very important to human personality. And human personality is not developed because the person, again, is mimicking, the person is imitating, the person is trying to fit in at the expense of all of these things, and becomes almost sort of robotic-like, machine-like. And as Jung's view is that that is likely to be a dangerous course, because man is not a machine that can be remolded in these kinds of ways. There's just too much that animates a person. There's too much that needs to, too many different desires and impulses and intentions that need to be attended to for a person to adopt that sort of personality well, without it some sort of negative fallback. So that sort of is in dominant form Jung's idea of the drawbacks of extreme extroversion. Now, going to the different types, the extroverted thinking type, the extroverted feeling type, the extroverted sensation type, and the extroverted intuitive type. I'm going to try to summarize this as quickly as I can. A lot of this material, this is just, again, this is new to me, so at this point I can pretty much only summarize a lot of what I'm reading from Jung. Now, the extroverted thinking type, Jung thinks, is someone that predominantly male, he says, someone that his life is based on sort of some sort of intellectual or conscious, some sort of conscious commitment to a set of ideas that he generally accepts as true. These ideas, I guess the thinking type is sort of misleading, because this person is not sort of reflective in the sense of subjecting all of these ideas to scrutiny, but he's consciously committed to certain conceptions and ideas about his life and the world. And these ideas become for him over time sort of a rigid iron law. Everyone who doesn't see things the way that the extroverted thinking type sees things is viewed as sort of stupid, immoral, unreasonable, without a conscience. The person sort of becomes in the end sort of a prig who wants to mold everyone into his own type, He doesn't at all get the fact that reality is and life is very complex. That there's no single formula that can capture everything in life. He anything new that's not within his sort of ideas and commitments in his consciousness, his sort of fundamental life values, his views, he hates them. He doesn't regard them at all as being true or even likely to be true. His feelings, Jung says, often can be very petty, mistrustful. He thinks that the truth is something he has within him, and the truth is something that must be trotted out for others to accept, and not to subject to scrutiny or any sort of common shared enterprise of finding out what the truth is. But he's someone that already believes he has the truth on life and is just there to have other people accept that truth. This person, again, the extroverted thinking type we're talking about, typically denigrates and views with suspicion any sort of activity that's based on sort of feeling or religions, cultivation of friendships, sort of one could say the softer side of life. His personal relationships often fail with others because he's so sort of committed to this ideal, whatever it is. He can often be sharp in tone, acrimonious, and aggressive. Person is often a hypocrite because, of course, his life is so complex. He usually, the ideal that he has doesn't sort of fit into his life so well, so he makes sort of some exceptions. He gives himself some exceptions to his rigid formula, sort of a safety valve. So he doesn't really, in the end, even adopt his own. While insisting that other people accept his ideal, he doesn't even follow that ideal himself, which makes him very hypocritical. This type very hypocritical. So that is the extroverted thinking type. The extroverted feeling type is, as we would expect, it's a personality that's very involved in the moment, the feelings of the moment. Very sort of loud expressions of emotion because this person is extroverted, so they're expressing their feelings to others. Their emotions can be often over the top. The expressions of that emotion can be over the top. It's not a problem. This personality trait's not a problem in theory, except Jung thinks pretty quickly life sort of presents conflicting emotions to people, and people don't feel the same way about one thing that they did from one day to the other. So we get sort of a multiple personality with the extroverted feeling type. The person loves something completely one day and then hates that thing the next day because their feelings, their entire personality is basically based on feeling. Their thinking, their rational, their reason is sort of repressed in these personalities. So basically, as long as they're completely feeling a good way about something or someone, everything is good, but then the person can turn 180 as the feeling changes, as it's bound to do, Jung thinks, because feelings are so unstable in human life. So that would be sort of the drawback of the extroverted feeling type. Now, the extroverted sensation type, Jung thinks, this is mainly a type we find in men. You would think of sort of, for example, someone that's sort of a thrill seeker, I guess you could, pleasure seeker, a thrill seeker that's really lives for the moment, continuously looks for higher and higher thrills out of whatever he's doing, seeks sort of grand sensory adventures, thrills, wants to sort of suck the lemon out of life, suck as much juice as he can out of life, enjoy it as much as possible. Thinks this can be done mainly, again, a very limited conception of what it means to enjoy life through various elaborate sensory adventures, elaborate vacations. For this type, Jung says that sort of the great problems of the day hang on where one is going to eat that night or where one is going to drink, what concert one is going to attend to. This person lives very purely on a physical realm of enjoying the moment, enjoying sensations, enjoying pleasures. Very few rational ideas at all interest this person. This person views reason and morality as boring, academic, uninteresting. And then this is again Jung describing this type. He sort of lacks rational judgment of himself and the world in which he lives. He doesn't understand himself. He doesn't understand the world he lives in because, again, he's so obsessed with just accumulating more sensations, accumulating more experiences that sort of hit the higher and higher peaks of sensation. And so, again, not a fundamentally rationally type, someone that's, again, focused on squeezing, I think that a good example here, again, squeezing the lemon dry out of life through experiences, through sensations. That would be that type. And then finally, on the extroverted type, we have the extroverted intuitive type. Now, this type, Jung thinks, is the lover sort of the new. He jumps after some new thing with incredible enthusiasm, some new project, some new study, some new person in his life, some new occupation, some new work, some new cause. Could be really anything, but it's something. First of all, the important thing is something outside of himself. So it's some cause or something that he's really seeking with enthusiasm. And then he jumps after it with enthusiasm, but then gives up on it very quickly as the next sort of thing, and next sort of idea or next project or next cause interests him. So Jung thinks that the problem with this kind of life, of course, is that it's sort of the example he gives is the person quits cultivation of their garden before the garden has bloomed. If the person would have stayed around and actually continued, pressed forward, and made consistent, stable progress in whatever they were doing in that cause or in that idea, they probably would have achieved some great things and it would have been good for them. But they typically just jump onto something different, and so they never get to enjoy anything. The garden blooms when they're on to the garden blooms, but they're already gone. I guess would be sort of the thought. And this morality is not fundamentally rational. This person is not a fundamentally rational person. Of course, again, as we talked about with Plato, sort of instrumental reason is operating. There's practical judgments of how to get things done. There's sort of an understanding of how to get day-to-day functions done. But fundamentally, they're not exposing their life choices and their commitments to reason, to the demands of reason, to figuring out what's good for them, figuring out if what they're doing makes sense, is consistent, and so forth. Not a fundamentally rational type, because the intuition that they have, sort of this cause or this vision they have of what's worth going for in life, this sort of vision is always fundamentally not necessarily rational. It could be a good thing still, but it's not fundamentally based on reason. It's based on some sort of vision that fuels everything they do. And so when that vision fades and when their new vision comes in, they're on to the next thing. So that's, again, the extroverted intuitive type. Now, those are the extroverted types. The introverted types, in general, Jung thinks that introversion is someone that, as opposed to the extrovert that, of course, was seeking life and sort of meaning in life, always outside of himself. The introvert is always looking at everything from the inside. The reality that matters most to him is his subjective impressions of things, his subjective interpretations or impressions of reality, his subjective understanding of reality. That is what matters for the introvert. It's not what everyone else thinks. It's not what he's told to think, but it's how he fundamentally perceives things that matters for the introvert. And I think Jung gives a very good example when he says that think about the introvert and think about what it means for someone for subjectivity to be very important to people. For the introvert, the subjective dimension of life. What does that mean? It's sort of kind of vague. And he gives the example of 5 people looking at a sunset or a beautiful image, and then all 5 people are asked to sort of draw the image, and everyone draws something different. And what that difference is what is I guess there'd be some common aspects of what the painting would look like, each 5 paintings. But there's something fundamentally different in each painting. There's something that's unique, and that uniqueness Jung thinks is what is the subjective element of that perception. Each person sort of grabs something out of the image that was unique to them, and that was some image, some searing image, some impression that unique to them and not shared by anyone else. And if that was sort of described to other people, the other people may not even have understood the sunset or the image in the same way. They may not have even seen that. It's a subjective impression. And so the introvert focuses on those subjective impressions in life. When he goes to a restaurant, for example, he's not going to look necessarily at, he's not going to judge the food and see whether it was, met with, all these 5 objective criteria that they sort of give you on a slip to say rate our restaurant. He's going to go based. His impression of the restaurant will be something very subjective, like the lighting or the mood he was in, or the music, or the certain smells. That's going to be what matters to him, not objectively what was on the menu or objectively what how good the food was. So that's sort of an introverted personality. Now, again, the dangers that the danger of introversion for Jung is that well, before that, Jung sort of discusses introversion, and he says there's definitely some benefits to it, and the main benefit is that the introvert, by sort of developing his subjective appreciation of life, he in some ways makes the world his own. Someone that never has any subjectivity, that never sort of cultivates that side of them, that doesn't have unique ideas of the world, doesn't have unique impressions, doesn't sort of fundamentally develop subjective elements of the personality and cultivate that and view that very valuable. That person over time sort of loses out on a lot. And I want to read a passage here where Jung sort of describes that very well. And he says, by overvaluing our capacity for objective cognition, we repress the importance of the subjective factor, which simply means a denial of the human subject. But what is the human subject? The human subject is man himself. We are the subject. Only a sick mind could forget that cognition must have a subject, and that there is no knowledge whatever, and therefore no world at all, unless I know has been said. Though with this statement one has already expressed the subjective limitation of all knowledge. So the world and the human being as he exists in the world necessarily has to have some sort of subjective knowledge of life, because as to everything we know, as to everything that we perceive, we are always subjectively perceiving it anyway. We are always having subjective perceptions of things. No two people are seeing the same things, or no two people that read the same book get the same things out of it. So everyone sort of has a subjective element to them, or should have a subjective element to the knowledge that they're gaining. And Jung thinks that when we deny the subjectivity, we sort of deny the human subject, because the human subject, in the end, the subjective subject, is really the only subject that can actually understand anything. We always understand the world fundamentally, Jung thinks, subjectively, through some sort of I know, where we, even if it's something we read in a book, we're sort of making it our own in some ways. We're not just repeating something that was told to us. Real knowledge starts with Jung, I think, sort of subjectively, when we sort of know something in that sense, and that is what he thinks is sort of the attribute or the virtue of the introverted type. He values his subjective impressions. He understands things. He sort of owns things that he knows. He owns his impressions because he develops that subjective side. Now, on the flip side, Jung thinks the danger of introversion is that if we develop that subjective side of us too much, it can lead to too much variation, he says, in individual hazards. Basically, our subjective impressions could be way, way, way out there. We could be viewing things totally wrong. The ideas can constantly change as our subjectivity changes. There's problems with the fact that our ideas are not rational in any way, shape, or form. They can't. They're so subjective. Subjectivity has gone so has gotten so developed that the person almost lives in his own world. Which again, it's a complicated issue because Jung, on the one hand, says, right, several pages before he discusses the danger of introversion, he talks about the virtue of sort of owning the world in that sense in your own way, developing subjective knowledge. But then he says if you develop it too much and you develop that subjective aspect of the personality too much, then you basically live in your own world. Your ideas become irrational. Your ideas constantly change, and you can't ever really use those ideas, communicate them to others, or even really benefit yourself through understanding them rationally, which is, I think, an important point for Jung. He seems to be, I think in some sense, people think of psychology or the discussion of the unconscious as being sort of an irrational subject, sort of the irrationality of the unconscious. But Jung is, I think, in the other post, I tried to bring this out. He's very clear to say we have to understand rationally the conscious and the unconscious, and we have to sort of give both sort of elements. Both have to be sort of expressed, but we have to understand what is the unconscious element. We should always seek to understand it better and seek to resolve the conflict between the conscious and the unconscious in better ways, and that is always done, Jung thinks, through reason and through other things, but through reason as well. So it's not a fundamentally irrational project in any way, shape, or form. Now, the different types again here, I'll try to go through these again as quickly as I can because it's again a lot of material. The introverted thinking type is someone that, again, now is someone that's valuing his subjective impressions, but he has subjective ideas. So this person is sort of intellectually motivated, but his ideas are very subjective. And so his ideas don't really try to incorporate facts. Subjective thoughts dominate. Facts are ignored, I think Jung says, to give the fantasy free play. The thoughts of this individual have sort of a mystical streak to it. Theories are basically collected merely for their own sake. The theories aren't really tested against any kind of reality. The thinking becomes sort of a mystical thinking, which is sort of unfruitful to other people. It's sort of it's as unfruitful, I guess. The introvert sort of escaped the problem of sort of dry, objective, detached, scientific thinking, where it's all about facts, all about what can be seen through the senses. But then he sort of went too far. He sort of gave up on reason, gave up on facts, gave up on sort of trying to explain his ideas to others, test those ideas, critique those ideas, perfect those ideas. And because of that, because all those things happened, the person's ideas become, in the end, impossibly vague, hard to relate to others. As that happens, the person becomes very bitter to any type of criticism because the ideas are becoming, he's feeling defensive about his ideas. And again, originally the ideas were very fresh and interesting to people. They were sort of infused with all his energy, but over time the ideas became negative and bitter because the person sort of was not able to relate them well to others and sort of responded negatively to that. Now, the introverted feeling type, Jung says this is mainly a type you find one finds in certain women. Again, not my ideas; these are Jung's ideas. He says this type is kind of quiet, hard to understand, often sort of has a sort of a childish or sort of a banal mask to them. They don't really reveal themselves very much. Sort of the outward demeanor is very harmonious and very cool. But the feeling, again, introverted feeling, the feelings of this person are sort of deep within, and they're intense. The outward, there's no show of the feelings on the outward. There's just sort of a childishness. There's sort of a cool demeanor. But inwardly, there's all this anger and emotion, often intense feeling, and since it's not being expressed, it often finds a way to get expressed through the person sort of domineering other people. Jung says often these types tend to be domineering parents. They have sort of a power over everyone around because there's some sort of deep feeling everyone can sort of sense intuitively about this person. Everyone senses there's something hidden within this person that's very scary in some sense from an emotional perspective. People are sort of scared of this kind of person. But over time, this person, because again they're not letting these feelings actually express themselves on the surface, it's within, it's building up. These feelings over time sort of envelop the person, and the person starts to have suspicions. Has suspicions about whether people are thinking about them. They try to start various rumors about other people, and he says over time, they don't shrink from any sort of meanness or baseness to create these rumors. The person is constantly sort of suspicious of everyone, constantly creating rumors, constantly doing whatever they can to sort of wreak havoc on other people. Definitely a negative personality type in many ways that Jung identifies here. And then the next two, the final two personality types is very similar to the extroverts, the introverted sensation type and the introverted intuition type. Now the introverted sensation type again seeks sensation, tries to suck the lemon, squeeze the lemon dry out of life, but he's introverted, so he's, Jung says, more likely to be sort of a painter or some sort of writer, someone that's sort of guided by the intensity of sort of subjective thoughts. Hard to predict what this person will like. His reactions to things are very arbitrary and unpredictable because he's fundamentally a sensation type. He cannot easily communicate his thoughts to others. He doesn't even really understand himself. The objective world remains to him sort of a make-believe world. There's some sort of kind of comedy. Because he's sort of wrapped up in his own thoughts. He's also very pushed very intensely by his subjective thoughts, his sensations, and so he isolates himself from the world because he regards the world as some sort of comedy or some sort of joke or whatever. So that is the introverted sensation type, and then finally there's the introverted intuitive type. Now this type of person Jung thinks is either some sort of prophet or an artist or kind of misunderstood genius. This person relies primarily on some sort of vision they have, some sort of searing vision they have that they bring to life. Their efforts, though, because they're so committed to a vision, become very one-sided. One man, of course, we know cannot see everything, so if someone is relying strictly on a vision, not relying on not subjecting that vision to rational scrutiny, not subjecting that reason to honest rational scrutiny, then the person becomes very one-sided. He will miss out on a bunch of things because his vision is so limited to one or two things or one or two ideas. He speaks in a language that's not understood by most people. He can only profess or proclaim things. He can't sort of convince people of things. And because of this, he sort of fails in the end. And I think the problem here, again, is sort of this introverted, intuitive type, someone that's, very strictly committed to vision. Is the problem here goes back all the way to Plato and the Crito. In the Crito, Socrates says, you must either persuade people as to the nature of injustice, or you must submit to what people think is justice. And so this person cannot persuade other people through reason of what they think is of what is just and what is not just. And because of that, they fail, because they're not fundamentally speaking the language of reason. They're not fundamentally proving their ideas to others. They're not persuading other people. They're trying to exhort through some sort of prophecy or proclamation but of course, if people don't share in that vision, they're not going to accept what is being said. So all of this is, it was a lot of material. Thank you for sticking through all that. But I think the clear lesson, of course, I'm going to put this under the moderation post. The clear lesson of all of these types is moderation is a critically important virtue in life. That moderation should never be viewed. 1 second. Let me get the.